Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. If you've ever translated a sentence word for word from your native language into English and got confused looks, you're not alone.
Yep. Today's episode is called Why Direct Translations Don't Always Work in English, and we're gonna explore why language doesn't always follow a straight path from one to another.
Exactly. A lot of learners think that if you just know the meaning of each word, you can just plug them into English and boom, it works.
But nope. Language is full of nuance, idioms, cultural context, and sentence structures that just don't translate neatly.
Let's start with an example. Imagine someone says, I have 25 years. That makes perfect sense in languages like Spanish or French.
Right. In Spanish, tengo 25 años literally means, I have 25 years. But in English, we say, I am 25 years old.
So if you translate it directly, it sounds strange to a native speaker. It's grammatically wrong in English, even though it's completely right in the original language.
Another example is with expressions. In some languages, there are sayings that sound poetic or powerful, but when you translate them into English literally, they sound weird.
Ha, yeah. Like in some languages, there's a way to say, don't make an elephant out of a mosquito, which means don't exaggerate. In English, we say, don't make a mountain out of a molehill.
Different animals, same meaning. But you can't just translate the mosquito version directly and expect people to understand.
That's why learning how English speakers actually phrase things is so important. It's not just about the words, it's about how they are used.
Exactly. English has its own logic. For example, think about phrasal verbs like look up, give in, or run out of. These don't translate well into many other languages.
Right, run out of literally translated could be confusing. Like if you say, I ran out of milk, it doesn't mean you physically ran somewhere with milk, it means you don't have any left.
It's a great reminder that some phrases have meanings you can't guess just from the individual words.
That's why learners should focus on chunks of language, like common expressions, phrases, and how they are actually used by native speakers.
And that's also why watching shows, listening to podcasts, and reading native content helps so much. You get a feel for what sounds right.
It also helps you avoid those awkward direct translation mistakes that make English sound robotic or strange.
Totally. And speaking of robotic, sometimes when people translate directly, their sentences come out sounding overly formal or stiff. Like, I request your presence at the dinner. It's grammatically correct, but nobody talks like that in casual conversation.
Yeah, a native speaker would just say, wanna come to dinner, or do you wanna join us for dinner? It's way more natural. That's why translating word for word doesn't always help with fluency.
Exactly. You have to think more about how people communicate, not just what they say. Another classic is, how do you call yourself, which is a direct translation from some languages, but in English we say, what's your name?
It's funny how those small differences can make a huge impact. And it's not just vocabulary or sentence structure, it's also about cultural expectations. Like, in some cultures, being direct is normal, but in English-speaking countries, especially in the UK, indirectness is often preferred.
Right. So if you translate a very direct sentence like, give me that report, it might come off as rude in English. A more natural version might be, could you send me that report when you have a chance?
Politeness is a huge part of how English works socially. And that's tough to translate directly, because different cultures have different ways of showing respect.
Another good one is humor. A joke that works in one language might fall completely flat in English if translated directly. Wordplay especially, puns usually don't survive translation.
Oh yeah. Humor is so culture-specific. Even sarcasm sounds different in English. You might hear someone say, oh, great, just what I needed, when something goes wrong, and they are being sarcastic. If you translate that literally and don't understand the tone, you might take it seriously.
So true. Understanding tone, context, and intention is key. It's not just the words themselves, it's how they're delivered and how they are meant to be understood.
That's why it's important to listen a lot, mimic native speech, and even ask questions like, "Is this how you would say it?" That's how you start thinking in English instead of translating from your native language.
And eventually, your brain starts to recognize which structures work in English and which don't. It takes time, but it's so worth it when you can speak naturally without overthinking.
Exactly. And sometimes it's helpful to look at examples of English phrases that don't translate well into other languages too. Like idioms, when someone says it's raining cats and dogs, and you try to translate that into another language, it makes no sense at all.
Yeah, or hit the books. If you take that literally, it sounds violent. But in English, it just means you're going to study hard. Idioms are such a big part of sounding fluent, but you can't really guess them by translating word for word.
That's why immersion is so helpful. Watching shows, listening to native conversations, even reading books, it helps you understand those expressions in real context. So your brain learns the patterns and not just the words.
And when you hear them enough, they just become natural. You don't even have to think, what does that mean? You just know. Like how we all understand what "break the ice" means in a social setting. You'd never guess that from the literal meaning.
It's the same with phrasal verbs. Put up with, look forward to, get over, they're impossible to guess by just translating each word. But once you hear them used in conversations again and again, you start picking them up automatically.
And that's the magic of not translating in your head. You're no longer thinking in your native language, you're just reacting in English. That's the real goal of fluency, right?
Totally. It's less about perfection and more about communication, getting the message across in a natural, clear, and confident way, using real English the way people actually speak it.
And one thing that really helps is noticing how English handles politeness and tone, too. Like, in some languages, people are super direct, but in English, saying something too directly can sound rude. That's why instead of, "Give me the book," a native speaker might say, "Could you pass me the book," even though they mean the same thing.
Exactly. And translating directly from a language that's more direct might make your English sound too strong, or even aggressive, even if you didn't mean it that way. English often relies on softening phrases, things like "would you mind?" or "I was wondering if."
Yeah, and when learners try to translate those kinds of polite forms literally into their native language, they often say, "That sounds too complicated." But in English, that's just normal. It's how people show respect or friendliness.
And even word order plays a role. For example, in some languages, it's totally fine to say "this I don't like." But in English, we'd say "I don't like this." If someone tries to directly translate their word order, it can sound unusual, or even confuse the listener.
Right. That's why it's more effective to learn English as it's spoken, not just translated. Instead of thinking, "How do I say this sentence in English?" we can train ourselves to think, "What would an English speaker say in this situation?"
That mindset shift really changes everything. You stop trying to convert language, and instead you start using it naturally. You start to feel the flow of the language instead of fighting with grammar and structure.
And that's also why listening and speaking practice is just as important as studying grammar. The more real English you hear, the easier it is to stop relying on direct translation.
Exactly. You're building an instinct for the language, so when it's time to speak, your brain isn't translating anymore. It's just communicating.
And you know, that's why phrases and expressions are super important too. Like, idioms or common expressions don't translate word for word. If someone says, "It's raining cats and dogs," and you try to translate that directly into another language, it might sound completely absurd.
Totally. Or think about phrasal verbs. Give up, look after, run into, they mean something totally different than just the individual words. A direct translation might not make sense at all in another language. Like, give up doesn't mean to physically hand something upwards, it means to quit.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of things that make English unique. That's why immersion, even if it's digital, like through movies, YouTube, or talking to AI, can help so much. You start picking up on those little language habits and the natural rhythm of how English is actually used.
Exactly. And over time, you develop a sense for what sounds right in English, not because you memorized a rule, but because you've heard it enough times in context. That's when you stop translating and start speaking fluently.
That's the goal, right? To not just know English, but to feel comfortable thinking in English. And that takes practice, patience, and a lot of exposure to how the language is actually used, not how it's translated.
So if anyone listening is still relying on translation all the time, don't worry, it's a normal stage. But the next step is to start letting go of that crutch and trust your growing instincts. That's when real fluency starts to kick in.
Yeah, and sometimes learners feel stuck because they are waiting for everything to translate perfectly before they speak. But the truth is, English often expresses things in totally different ways. Like, we say, I miss you, but in some languages, it's like, you are missing from me. It's not about one being right or wrong, it's just different logic.
Right, and that's such a good point. Language reflects culture and thinking styles. English tends to be more direct in some ways, but also really vague in others. For example, I'm kind of busy, or maybe later, those aren't always literal. They can be polite ways to say no.
Exactly. If you translated those literally, you might totally misunderstand the meaning. That's why learning the function of phrases, like whether they are polite, indirect, sarcastic, or formal, is even more important than the literal words.
And that's why watching real conversations, like vlogs or interviews, helps so much. You get to see how native speakers use body language, tone of voice, pauses. It gives you way more context than just the words.
Plus, it trains your brain to recognize patterns. After a while, you hear something like, would you mind, and you don't stop to analyze it. You just know it means someone's making a polite request, and you respond naturally.
Which is exactly how you break free from that translation loop. You stop needing to turn everything into your native language, and instead you just respond in English. That's where confidence really builds.
Totally. And you know what else helps? Phrasal verbs. I know they seem scary at first because look up, look into, and look after all mean different things, but once you get used to how they work in context, they actually start to make English sound more natural.
Yes. And idioms too. Like, if someone says it's raining cats and dogs, they don't actually mean animals falling from the sky. But once you understand it's just a colorful way of saying it's raining heavily, it sticks. It's not about logic, it's about usage.
Exactly. And people get worried about saying things wrong, but English speakers are usually pretty understanding. They'll get what you mean, even if you don't say it perfectly. Sometimes just the effort to say it naturally, using the right tone, matters more than grammar.
And over time, when you expose yourself to these patterns, whether through conversations, podcasts, series, or even memes, you just pick them up. It's like you build your own intuition for the language. You don't need to memorize rules for everything.
Yeah, it's like your brain starts recognizing English, not as a version of your first language. You just get used to how things are said, not how they should be translated.
That's the key takeaway. If you really want to sound natural in English, stop relying on direct translations. Embrace the way English expresses ideas, even if it feels different from your native language. That's where real fluency starts.
Exactly. Focus on meaning, not word-for-word accuracy. Think in English, practice often, and let yourself make mistakes. That's part of the process. The more you immerse yourself in how English is actually used, the more confident and natural you'll become.
So, the next time you find yourself tempted to translate directly from your native language, remember these tips. Try to focus on understanding the meaning, and don't be afraid to ask questions or look for context. Language learning is a journey, and each step brings you closer to fluency.
Absolutely. And as always, practice makes perfect. So keep immersing yourself in English, and don't be afraid to experiment with how you express yourself. We'll catch you next time with more insights and tips to help you on your language learning journey.
Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, happy learning.